Can you state your full name and spell it, please?
And spell it.
And
That'll be tough. Yeah, I use the initial R
Okay.
and then Lars Herseth.
Okay.
L-A-R-S-H-E-R-S-E-T-H.
Okay.
The initial R is for Ralph, who was my father.
Yeah.
The middle name Lars was my grandfather, so I was named after both.
Okay. And do we have your permission to use this interview?
Sure, yes.
Where and when were you born?
Aberdeen, South Dakota, on June 16th, 1946.
Okay. As a young boy or as a teenager, what was your first job?
Well, probably picking eggs and washing them and occasionally milking a cow and mowing the yard. I was a farm boy.
Okay.
So help out on the farm was the first job, and then of course you graduate to
Yeah.
bigger things, and before you can reach your pedals, you're driving the grain truck. So
Okay. Yeah. Now, where was the
my
farm?
first paying job, however, was in Pierre. I worked at a gas station and I
Oh.
filled cars and washed windows.
Okay. As a teenager, or?
Yeah,
Okay.
I was in junior high
Okay.
in Pierre.
Okay. And was your dad governor then?
He was.
Okay. And you were at the
I
gas
think he
station?
pulled some strings to get me the job.
Might have been. Might have been. Where's the farm?
It's northeast of Aberdeen, about 35 miles.
Okay.
It's on Sand Lake National Wildlife Refuge, if you're
Okay.
familiar with that.
I
The
am. Yeah.
Jim River runs through it,
Okay.
and when it went in the mid-30s, it took about 800 acres from my grandfather's operation up there.
Okay.
And my dad was one of the first superintendents of that CCC program that put that
Okay.
refuge in.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. So, was that a federal project at the time, the CCC?
Yeah, it's like the WPA,
Yes.
CCC, FDR,
Okay.
middle of the Depression, and
Right.
trying to come out of it.
Right. So how did during the Dust Bowl and the Depression, how did your family farm fare?
Well, they made it through, but both dad had a good outside paying job
Yeah.
with the CCC for the times.
Yeah.
My mother they were not married yet at that time.
Okay.
She was school superintendent of Brown County Rural Schools.
Your mom was?
My mom was the
Okay.
first elected official in our family.
Your mom was the first elected official?
That's right, yeah.
And she was elected as the school board president, or?
Well, back at that time, they had a lot of rural schools.
Yeah.
And they had a county superintendent of schools.
Okay.
Of all of those one-room schoolhouses that were 1 to 8 grades.
Right.
And so she was the superintendent of, I think Brown County had over 100 of them.
Probably. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was so, in kind of the getting closer to the end of the Depression, but both my mom and my dad at that time, they were going together, but they both had pretty good jobs for the time.
Yeah.
So they decided to get married in 1937.
Okay. What did your family raise on the farm?
Well, Aberdeen Angus cattle. My grandfather was one of the first to bring some of those into the area.
Okay.
And of course, back then, we still call it the Herseth Ranch today, because in that particular time, it was, most of the income was all from livestock. Cattle, hogs. The crops that were raised were pushed through the livestock.
Okay.
A little bit of wheat at that time for cash crop.
Okay.
It's only in the more recent movements of our technology and agriculture that we're basically a farm now. We still have some cows and calf operation, but it's small compared to what it used to be.
Yeah.
Because most of the ground has been broken up and we're raising beans and corn on it.
Okay.
So,
and the ducks and the geese, I suppose, come through there.
they do, yes.
And so did you hunt as a boy a lot, or?
Oh yeah, as a young man, I went out with my dad numerous times.
Yeah.
In fact, when I started wearing glasses, I was only about 12 years old, but it was because my dad would hit a duck or a goose and want me to go retrieve it, and I couldn't find it. I didn't even see it come out of the flock, so how did I know where to look?
So that's how you found out you need glasses?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It said, go get your eyes tested, yeah.
Yeah. Well, what are your earliest memories? And you said your mom was the first one elected. I hadn't even thought to ask questions about that aspect of things. Your family's deeply involved in politics. Where do you think that came with?
Well, probably even back then, you know, probably my grandfather, who emigrated here from Norway in the middle to late 1880s. But that school superintendent job, he kind of felt that was a family job. He had his daughter in the job before mom, and then his soon-to-be daughter-in-law, and then there was another good friend of the family that was the school superintendent before those two, and they were all deputies of those. So my grandfather didn't run for political office, but he was certainly politically active.
Yeah. So the education kind of was important to him, it sounds like, if they were running for school superintendent and so forth.
Well, yeah, it was both. You know, I don't know for sure what's happened with the emphasis, but I think that generation put a big emphasis on getting as much education as you could.
Mm-hmm.
I know my mother was one of the first in her family, and I was a large family, the Buntrock family, to get her education, which at that time was a one-year teacher's degree from Northern Normal. She went back and got a 2-year degree a little bit later, and then superintendent of schools. But Dad, of course, went to North Dakota school. The other branch of our family is up in North Dakota, but he went up there mainly to play football.
Okay.
He was a pretty good athlete for the time, and he played football a little bit and then felt that he was needed back on the farm.
Okay.
So he came back there and then went to Northern a couple of fall semesters so he could play football.
Okay.
So that was kind of the extent of his education too.
Okay.
Either one of them got a 4-year degree.
I see, okay. Now, you mentioned your great-grandfather who came from Norway.
My
Or
grandfather.
your grandfather came from Norway. So why did he leave Norway? What was the impetus to leave?
I'm not sure, but I think he was the oldest in his family. He could have had the farm there outside of Hammer. I've been back to our family farm. We still have some relatives there.
Good, yeah.
When Stephanie goes back there with some of her things with Augustana University, she keeps in touch with them.
That's great.
Yeah, so we do still have relatives back there, and he could have stayed there, but it must have been a little touch of adventure or something in him, that he wanted to come over to this country and see what he could do.
Do you know, were there friends that he came with, or was it?
No, he came with a brother then later who went back.
Okay.
And then he had relatives who homesteaded there. And he didn't really homestead. He came and worked for his relatives that were homesteading.
I see.
And when they proved up part of their homestead, they kind of wanted to move back. Grandpa stayed there renting the land from them and later bought them out.
Oh, okay.
And then a little bit later, I think in the early 1900s, he had another brother that came back from Norway and settled in the Red River Valley up in North Dakota.
Yeah. Okay.
They farmed in Minnesota, but they lived in Drayton, North Dakota. So that's the other branch of our family up there.
Okay. Well, you mentioned your other job in Pierre. What do you recall from your dad's from your perspective of your dad's time as governor? Are there memories that you have, or there, because he becomes governor in 58.
In 58.
He's elected.
He's elected. He's governor 59 and 60.
59 and 60.
Yeah.
Are there issues or that struck you still as you saw your dad working through those issues?
Well, you know, I think at that stage, as a junior high young guy that's in about every sport that has a bouncing ball to it, you know, I didn't pay a lot of attention.
Mm-hmm.
It was maybe later that I looked back on what some of the issues were at the time.
Right.
You know, and of course, there was a tax study done under Governor Herseth's administration.
Mm-hmm.
That was referred to for years and years, once in a while still is, as to what the recommendations were out of those tax studies.
Yeah.
You know, there were other issues. I remember the age for driving, getting a driver's license, went up during that time, and the kids that I was in school with didn't particularly like that. Thought that maybe I should have some input into it, you know, so some of those kind of issues.
Yeah.
But it was, from looking back at it at the time, I didn't remember this, but it was the first time they organized a teacher's retirement system in the state of South Dakota.
Right.
A lot of the older teachers, when I was more active in politics, would remind me of that all the time, that they remembered Dad because of his starting that,
Pension plan.
yeah,
Yeah.
that pension plan for our South Dakota educators.
Right.
So that was one of the things they looked at. And of course, 2-year terms, we all know what 2-year terms are. You don't have a very good chance, and you got opposite party in power, you're not going to have a long legislative list of accomplishments.
Right.
But some of them were pretty important.
Right. So, where did you go to college then?
I went to college at the University of South Dakota,
Okay.
USD.
And what was your major?
Government and history.
Okay. Oh, very good.
I had at one time planned on maybe going into law school, and unfortunately Dad passed away when I was handing in my last paper for Doc Farber in the government department.
Yeah.
I still remember him when I went to complain about not getting an A from him because that's all I'd had in the quizzes, and he says, "Herseth," he says, "you got a B from me? How did you ever get a B?" And I was done. I just left and said, "See you later, Doc Farber." But he was an institution of his own here in this state.
I've heard a lot about him.
Yeah.
We interviewed someone in the last round of these who told me the reorganization of state government came out of Farber. I mean, Doc Farber.
Well, he maybe had a hand in it, but it came out of Dick Knight.
Right. He's the Knight implemented it, but
Yeah.
But I think the study group and so forth was pushed by Farber and
Oh, it could be. Maybe
yeah.
maybe Doc Clem back in that
Yes.
time too.
Yeah.
Perhaps it was kind of a model of what government should look like to function a little better rather than a bunch of boards and commissions.
Yeah.
And Dick Knight implemented that
Yeah.
when he had a Democrat majority
Yeah. Yeah.
in the 70s.
Well, let's talk about that Democrat majority in the 70s and so forth. That's something that, if you look back all the way to the 1880s, 1890s, there are moments when the Democrats kind of rise up and then fall off, and now we seem to go, well, I think that legislature makeup and so forth reflects prior to the Depression and then maybe again in the 1950s, and so there's this kind of bow wave back and forth or up and down. What do you think are the factors that, well, looking at it, your dad ran for re-election in '60 and is defeated. I think it was a close one, though.
It was close.
Yeah.
If you look at the number of votes that Kennedy lost to Nixon by in the
Right.
state of South
in the
Dakota,
state, yeah.
and you look at what Dad's race was with Archie Gubrud,
Yeah,
his was very close. I mean, a couple thousand votes.
right.
And the head of the ticket, Kennedy, was getting wiped out by 50,000 votes or something
Yes.
in that neighborhood, you
Yeah.
know. So he had to have a lot of crossovers, but he didn't
Yeah.
get quite enough of
Not
them.
quite enough, yeah. What do you, traditionally then, I guess, going back all the way to your Norwegian grandfather, did he join the Democratic Party?
Yeah, he was, which was somewhat surprising, and I don't
Yeah.
really know the reason, because most of the family
Yeah,
is Republican.
okay,
Yeah, the North Dakota group's all Republican.
okay.
We still get along, though.
Yeah.
We see each other at, funerals and
Right.
occasional wedding.
Yeah.
More funerals than weddings.
Right. That's interesting, the populists in North Dakota are for a time more successful in developing a third party.
Yeah,
And I think it's Governor Norbeck who successfully takes a lot of those progressive ideas that a lot of the populists had at the time in the 1920s and brings them into the GOP
yeah,
and kind of avoids a third party issue in South Dakota.
right. I think they referred to that as nonpartisan league.
Yes, the NPL. That's right.
And Brown County, South Dakota, was the only county in South Dakota that the nonpartisan league got organized.
Yes,
So that gives you a little idea of where our roots were up there. I mean,
Yeah.
we were in one of the only areas that the nonpartisan league got organized. But it was kind of a populist grassroots movement, and you're right, Peter Norbeck was, well, in today's standards, he'd be pretty progressive.
yeah. Well, he was at the time. too.
Yeah.
I mean, Teddy Roosevelt.
He was at the time, right?
Yeah, I think, in fact, when Teddy Roosevelt runs in 1912, the Republicans in the state make sure that that the GOP person is not on the ballot, which I just was doing some
Yeah.
research on Teddy Roosevelt. In 1912, he won 50% of the general vote in the presidential election in 1912.
Is that
Because
where he was the
Taft-
Bull Moose Party?
Yes, as the Bull Moose Party.
Yeah.
So he runs as a Bull Moose. They kept Taft off the ticket in 1912.
Yeah,
That's how strong the progressives within the GOP were.
Right.
They wanted Roosevelt more than they wanted Taft.
yeah.
So.
Huh. Interesting, our
Yeah.
history.
Yes.
Some of us will be glad when we can refer to this time as history.
Some of us will, that's right. Well, then, what's your job out of college? You said you wanted to go to law school or something?
Well, I thought about it a little bit and then thought that maybe I didn't want to really practice law. I wouldn't have minded having a law degree, but I didn't want to do the daily work of practicing law.
Yeah.
And so I thought a little bit about graduate school, and then Dad passed away on the last day of my classes, actually, and I made the decision to come up to the ranch.
Okay.
At the time, thinking it may be a temporary decision,
Yeah.
and it didn't turn in. I've been there ever since, and that I haven't really second guessed it. I've thought of those things in your life that
Right.
come up, the decisions that you make, where do you go to school or whatever, depend on who you meet and who you
Yeah.
marry, all of those things. So you think about them, but I've never second guessed them because I've been very satisfied in the decision I made to stay at the ranch,
Yeah.
to this day, in fact.
Sure. Sure. Well, why did you decide to run and get involved in politics yourself then? Was that your first race in '74?
Let's see, 74. I was on the ballot a few times in different kinds, mostly like to be a delegate to a convention or something like that, and you had to run for those positions. They were more competitive then. And so I was on the ballot a couple times for that as a delegate to state conventions. I was also, the first time I was ever on the ballot, I was just 21. I don't know that I was even 22. I was an elector for Eugene McCarthy.
Oh,
And when Eugene McCarthy had taken on LBJ.
yeah.
And of course, was one of the reasons that LBJ pulled out of the race. My dad, however, was a big supporter of Lyndon Baines Johnson, and of course Hubert Humphrey,
Yeah.
who was a South Dakotan originally.
Yeah.
And so he was over there. He was on the electors for Hubert Humphrey, because that's who took the mantle when LBJ said he wasn't going to run.
Yeah.
I'm on the electors for Eugene McCarthy,
Okay.
and a little upset that Robert Kennedy, of course, challenged then after he found that the waters were pretty warm.
Yeah.
And so both Dad and I lost
Yeah.
because
That's right.
Robert Kennedy won that
He
primary.
wins the South Dakota primary.
And the evening where South Dakota primary was the same date as the California primary.
Right.
And that evening, of course, we all know what that history is, unfortunately.
Right.
So those were kind of my first times. My first ballot, I was opposite my dad.
Okay.
So when I then came back to the ranch, I was at the university yet at that time. Came back to the ranch, it was the fact that there had been so many of us, both my mom and my dad or whatever, in Brown County politics. I mean, I was active in Brown County politics right off the bat, so it's kind of a natural to say, well, why don't you run for the legislature?
Yeah.
And I actually did debate that quite a bit. I didn't know whether, I was pretty young. I was only, I don't know, 26 or something like that, 27.
Okay.
And didn't know whether I should have that distracting me or not, but I changed my mind and ran and won. We were in a multi-member district at that time. You kind of ran at large, so there were 4 Senate candidates running for 2 spots, and there were 8 House candidates running for 4 spots
Okay.
back at that time.
Okay.
And I finished, I think, 4th.
Just squeaked
And
by.
just squeezed by it. Actually, I thought it would be easier than that. I mean, I think I spent $34 in my campaign for the House of Representatives at that time. I had one ad before the election and a thank you after the election. But, I always, I guess, assumed, we're at that time a pretty good Democrat county, and I couldn't understand how these 2 Republicans over here could beat me.
Yeah.
And they did. Two Republicans beat me, 1 Democrat who had been our sheriff for a while, and then I ran 4th, but that gave me a seat.
Yeah.
So,
Fourth is as good as first.
yeah, at that time it was, yeah.
Yeah.
So I then spent 12 years in the South Dakota House.
Okay.
And about 8 of those, I was the minority leader of our caucus.
Yeah. So, what were the issues? I think Knipe is still governor in '75.
Knipe, yes, is still governor at that time, and it was I came in at that point, the reorganization legislation had passed at
Okay.
that point. So I kind of came in as a recipient of some of that. The legislative reorganization part of that meant that no longer could a committee chairman take your bill and stick it in a pigeon, what they called a pigeonhole, and never see the light of day. You know, freshman legislators prior to that would hardly ever get their bills heard because the chairman had all the power. And if they didn't like your bill, you never saw it again. Under the reorganization, every bill that was introduced, regardless of who introduced it, had to have a hearing. And that's still the case today.
That's right.
Actually, we have a better system in that regard than they do on the national level, in my opinion.
Yes.
But, you know, that we kind of received the benefit of that. But the major issue then as I came in was the session before they had had an income tax bill that had passed both houses. Democrats controlled both houses. It tied in the Senate and failed on a vote of the lieutenant governor of Dick Knipes, who was Bill Doherty.
Yes.
And there's always been an argument, well, he's lieutenant governor, his vote wouldn't have counted on a major piece of legislation like that anyway, one way or the other. It still failed, it was a tie.
Yeah.
Well, that's, I guess, all part of history, but the other part of that history is, of course, Democrats had that legacy of an income tax bill that they had introduced and passed, and South Dakota came this close to having an income tax, even though I think way back in the 30s or something they did have an income tax for a brief period of time. But anyway, that hung as a mantle around Democrats in every election almost to this day.
Yeah.
They're still labeled as the pro-income tax party. When I ran for governor against George Mickelson, he and Walter Dale Miller tried to do, and probably successfully hung that on me too, because I had voted for some. On the other hand, it was a little like the pot calling the kettle black, because both Walter Dale Miller and George Mickelson had voted for corporate income tax bills when I was sitting in the House with them. So, yeah, I guess if it works to convince some voters out there, have at it. But and maybe it did work, but it wasn't being 100% above board with that issue either. But it's worked for them. I mean, they've used that issue election after election as to whether we should have an income tax or not. So that was really the debate when I first came in, was tax issues throughout most of the 70s. And education. Education, face it, my history goes over 20 years there, so every session sometimes has different issues that are kind of predominant. But every session, education and taxation are there. The general budget and education are in every session, and somewhat controversial in one form or another. And then each period is highlighted, whether it's income tax or whether it's low-level nuclear waste in the 80s, you had those as issues. You had the farm crisis in the mid-80s, where the whole legislature, which, by the way, was a Democrat bill to have the whole state legislature fly to Washington, D.C. and lobby Congress on behalf of the farm crisis. And of course, there wasn't a lot of Republican support, and at that time we're pretty competitive. They had the edge in both houses right then, but not by big margins. And there was always kind of a group in the Republican House side anyway that liked to vote with us once in a while, so that really evened out. Of course, we had 2 or 3 Democrats that liked to go over to their side once in a while too. But it was close enough that you had that competitive edge on almost all the controversial issues. And remember, most of the issues, 95% of them aren't controversial. They just either don't show up on the floor or they go sailing through the floor. It's a small percentage where the sides kind of have to sort it all out.
Right.
But anyway, that being a Democrat issue that was getting momentum, I remember Janklow was the governor at the time, who was kind of a populist in his own way, with buying a railroad. We'll maybe get to the railroad later in this interview, but anyway, Joe Barnett was the majority leader from my own county in Brown County on the Republican side, and he was very good leader over there, and somewhat of a mentor of mine, even though policy-wise we were on opposite sides and in opposite corners in the legislative floor. But he said, look, if we're going to do this, he said, we're going to do it not as a partisan. In other words, there were all Democrats on this bill. He said, we'll kill this bill and hog house this other bill, which term I'm sure you've had explained a number of times what hog housing is in South Dakota government. Yeah. But anyway, we'll put this same thing flying in to do this lobbying bit with Congress, and we'll do it under the leadership of both House and Senate, both Republican and Democrat. Okay. It'll be a bipartisan deal. Yeah. And, excuse me a minute. Sure. That's what we did. We put it onto a different bill, and then we all flew to Washington, D.C. to lobby different legislators. We didn't really need to lobby our own. Our own were fine. Right. But it was one of the first times that it was ever done. We got some national news coverage out of it and everything, and we did end up with getting some, I don't know whether you could say directly because of our flying in there, but Congress did act. They passed some bills that made it a lot better for a lot of people out on the farm as far as getting resolution to where they were at in this crisis.
Was this in response to, because I think this is about the time that Reagan vetoes the farm bill. Was that the same year?
I couldn't tell you that. I don't know that for sure.
I've had a discussion with Tom Daschle about the legislature coming out and flying out, and he said Speaker Foley was, really glad to have you guys there, and got into the White House.
Yeah.
Reagan didn't come to the meeting, but I guess the vice president was there. He looked upon that as a really great event.
And I think it was, and I think it had an impact. Yeah. And I think it's one of those things that's pretty easy for us for your project here, in looking at events that happen in South Dakota history that can be easily overlooked as far as what kind of an impact it had during that given session, or did it have an impact larger than that? Yeah. And I think it did, and I would want it to be a part of our South Dakota history that we remember.
Yeah. Well, it's an astonishing thing. I don't know that, as you said, it doesn't happen all that often.
No.
Where I think 103 or 104 of them, almost everybody flew out there.
Yeah, I believe, I didn't know anybody was absent, but there could have been because of travel or whatever. And I remember flying back then. I was on the plane with Governor Bill Janklow and his family, Mary Dean. Okay. Russell was there. Okay. Russell wanted to play a few little poker on the way along, plane ride back. Yeah. So we took a little money off from Russell. Bill was up there asleep and he didn't care. Russell had to go up to Mary Dean and get a little replenishment so he could keep playing a little bit. A little penny ante stuff.
This is in a commercial plane on the way back?
No.
Or was
no, it was I think it was a South Dakota Air National Guard beast, that just kind of plunders through there. It doesn't go anywhere very fast.
A C-130.
Yeah, something like that.
That's an interesting story. I'll have to ask Russell about that.
Yeah.
Well, the farm crisis is something that needs to get more coverage, and I was really pleased that Senator Daschle would talk to me about that, and it's come up in several iterations with many of the people we've spoken to.
Good.
When would you kind of say that's the beginning of the crisis? When did you really notice that farmers were in distress, or maybe, I mean, you owned a farm, right? So this was,
Yeah.
You were living.
Oh, I was living, and I about
Right.
lost our place during the mid-'80s. I don't know, it was a little bit of a complex issue because
Yeah.
it had to do with the valuations of your property. I mean, we were probably as a group over borrowing.
Yeah.
You know, we were leveraged too high. On the other hand, you were still servicing that leverage position as long as things stayed fairly good, but if you had any hiccup in prices at all, you were in trouble.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we had a devaluation of land values.
Okay.
And when the devaluation of land values happened, everybody's statement was done.
Yeah.
Their note could be called,
Right.
whether it was bank, whether it was FHA, or whoever it was.
Yeah.
But it wasn't any time that you could say this was it, because it was kind of a gradual thing that happened.
Right.
But what then pulled the trigger to the crisis happening was a devaluation of the farm property.
Okay. And that was state driven?
No.
Or how did that occur?
It occurred just from the fact that people weren't paying for land what they were before.
I
If
see.
you had your statement
Yeah.
sitting there saying my land's worth $500 an acre,
Yeah.
and everything is balanced out over here, and it shows that you still have a net worth and you can service your debt,
Okay.
you're okay.
Right.
All of a sudden, you gotta put a statement over here where your land is worth $250 an acre,
Yeah.
and it's all red ink under here, and you can't service the debt, so therefore the lenders, whether public or private, can call your notes. And that's what happened in mass. I mean, people were having their notes called all across the country, and we're well aware in Minnesota, I mean, they even had some shootings involved with it, you know, and
Right.
it was not a good scene.
What did you think of these kind of pop-up advocacy groups for farmers that sprang up in Nebraska, Colorado, Minnesota, and so forth in response to this? You're in the legislature by this time. You see these groups. They had protests in Pierre.
Yeah.
How did you manage that? What was your response to that?
Well, I think, you know, from the state level, you couldn't pass legislation to alleviate what was going on as to what the problem was.
Yeah.
So you listened as well as you could and empathized with them
Right.
because they were bringing attention to something that was affecting South Dakota, North Dakota, everybody in the Midwest. And getting the attention more. Our congressional delegation was certainly well tuned in to what was going on out here and was doing their best. But our reaction to those groups was mostly favorable.
Yeah.
And I say mostly because sometimes a tractor cage or something coming into Pierre, South Dakota, and driving around the area that you used to be able to drive around, that you can't anymore. I didn't know what good it would be. And there was a sense that maybe there were a few in there that were a little fragile, that you didn't fear too much for safety, but there was always that question in the back of your mind, because you knew that tempers were short out there, and people's livelihood was on the line. So they had a pretty favorable response in Pierre, and that's why I said, though guarded maybe, with some of the groups that came in. But overall, anybody who was contributing to drawing interest to that particular problem going on across the Midwest and then in farm communities, I think it was pretty well received most of the time by the South Dakota legislature. As a result of some of that activity, I mean, we thought we should all go to Washington D.C. You know, and do that work. And by the way, you know, some thought maybe you just go to Washington and not tend to business, but from my experience there, it was all work. There wasn't a lot of playtime left for you to go out in the town in Washington D.C. It was in legislative offices up and down the hill, and for 2 days pretty intensive, and then back home.
On an ugly military plane.
Yeah, on a slow, ugly military plane.
Yeah. Well, did this situation then animate your run for governor? Or what prompted the...
No, I think you know, that was probably already in the works. You look at those things and they're not always just spontaneous. You kind of lay out, I've been here 12 years now, maybe I should do something else, and what should that something else be? And that looked like the time for me to give that a try, if I was going to give that a try. So, that had already been kind of in the mill at that time. In fact, I'm trying to remember, I don't think I was announced for governor yet at that time, but pretty soon thereafter, I think, because if I remember right, I think that was 1985 maybe? Yeah. Or was it 84? 84 or 5.
You ran in 86, right?
Ran in 86, and the fly-in was before that.
Oh, yes, the fly-in was before that.
Yeah. Okay. I might mention in conjunction with that, though, and that happened later, and maybe we want to come back to the 86 kind of difference between House and run for governor and then coming back in the Senate. But one of the things that I think also is a result of a lot of that mid-80s agricultural crisis thing was a little more interest among farmers themselves, farm groups, and legislators supporting that kind of legislation to develop the ethanol industry. That was kind of the beginning of state legislation that would put enhancements in there. They were rather elementary in the beginning. In late 80s, early 90s, they were more and more aggressive. But that was kind of the beginning of agriculture realizing that they needed something else besides the government to keep them afloat. And so I think that, as I look back on it, and I spent a number of years, in fact longer than I was in the legislature, with the ethanol industry. And I think it was something that successfully happened due to legislation on the state level and also on the federal level with the RFS under Bush, of which Daschle, Johnson, Stephanie were all active in getting the RFS through. And surprisingly, an oil state president, George Bush, best program that got that industry really rolling. And build it to what it is today. And I know there's even a lot of farmers that question ethanol, but believe me, that boat getting raised the way it did, it raised all the boats out there, whether you liked ethanol or not. You have a more successful farm today because of it.
The RFS stands for
Renewable Fuel Standard.
So this would be the standard that basically the government dictated certain percent in every gallon or something like that would be mixed.
It created created the market. You couldn't get froze out of the market
Right.
by the oil companies.
So today, if I go to the pump, I have a choice between 10%, sometimes there's a choice another higher, but there's at least a
15 or
10%
30,
choice.
yeah, or
So
10,
Okay,
or none.
or none, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so
The land of the free.
Yeah, well, it's my choice, right, but there's always an option. Generally,
Right.
I can't think of a time I've been to a gas station in the last 20 years where there wasn't at least 10%.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, here, you might, in some states, it might be there regardless,
Yeah,
at whatever percent they have.
okay,
I know California has, within their state, that's a whole different ballgame out
Yeah.
there, which I'll never understand.
I won't either.
But you go over here to Minnesota, I'm not sure whether it's labeled on the pump or not, you're getting ethanol.
Yeah, okay,
But I could be wrong on that too. I haven't looked at their pumps lately to see.
So did that start in the early 80s? That was something?
The initial legislation started then
Okay,
to kind of give them a little boost. They were state boost, not federal boost. A little subsidy, you might call them. I know when they first started, we only had one producer, which was Broynes.
yeah,
And of course, he's a longtime friend of mine, but I remember when he was a young guy sitting there in the
yeah,
rotunda of the Capitol saying, I got this little plant down there at Springfield or wherever it was, a 2 million gallon plant that needs a little help to get through here.
right. So he
And
was-
so we would come up with a little something in a state program to help that situation out. Bill Janklow never particularly liked those. He couldn't understand why he was helping out this one individual in South Dakota.
Oh, okay.
So,
So he didn't support it, but he didn't?
well, they kind of supported the theory of what ethanol could maybe do.
Yeah.
He didn't like the fact that we only had one individual doing it in
Oh.
South Dakota.
Okay,
Yeah. So,
yeah, I can see that, I guess. But largely, those bills passed bipartisan, or was it more ag and?
yeah, I think the split was a little more that way
Okay.
than Democrat, Republican.
Yeah,
It generally had the support of the Democrat caucus,
yeah,
and we'd pull off a half a dozen Republicans over there,
okay,
then and get them passed.
right,
But in its early stages, it was probably 2/3 Democrat, and maybe a third at the most Republican that would pass that legislation.
right,
But the break, your reference, was the break of the difference between the two sides there was probably more rural urban,
yeah. Now, certainly,
Aggie, non-Aggie.
yeah, Governor, since, well, your father, Foss, the effort to diversify South Dakota's economy, certainly been a marquee push of every governor, because of, if ag prices go down and the state government goes down, everybody's in the hole. So, was this seen as a diversification kind of thing, even within agriculture? Or,
Are you referring to the ethanol?
yes, yes,
I don't know for sure the answer to that question. I think, I don't believe when it was first coming into the mainstream that anybody had the vision to say it would do the impact that it ended up doing.
okay, okay,
So I don't think they looked at it as a save-all for agriculture,
right,
but more, maybe this will help
yeah,
type of thing.
okay, okay,
I don't think they looked at it as an overall solution.
yeah,
I know I didn't anyway. I just,
right,
it became much more successful
yeah,
than I ever thought it would.
yeah,
And it took a lot of people beyond government to do that.
really push it, yeah,
The South Dakota Corn Utilization Council, and when I got out of the legislature, they were already very active in doing everything they could to get ethanol plants up and running. They had a good program put together out of
yeah,
what were actually farmer dollars, because the checkoff dollars that were funding the utilization council all came from farmers that were producing the corn and allowing their corn to have this 1 cent checkoff to fund that. And again, if they didn't like it, they could fill out the form and get it back at the end of the year, which we had a lot of farmers doing. I remember when I was on that board, one of my jobs every year was to write a letter to everybody in my district that was refunding and say, look, this is what we're doing. You know, leave your money in there with us. And they did. They did a good job. Lisa Richardson, who was the executive director of that group, did a good job. She was very proactive in helping this ethanol to get off the ground in South Dakota.
My father-in-law farms near Hudson, and he bought shares in what's now Poet's ethanol plant.
Yeah.
He was there the day that plant opened. I think Senator Daschle was there, maybe it was even Congressman Daschle. It's been a while. But he said to me, one of the best things that the Bryans ever did was getting farmers to buy in.
Yeah.
Was that their kind of their idea, or to sell shares in this?
Oh, I don't think it was. I don't think that was a new idea with them, because I think we had a lot of kind of co-op type deals where you share in the dividends. You know, that theory had been out there a long time. I think it was pretty smart to align that way, because it gave you a lot more voices to take the message out, whether it was to Washington or to Pierre or to individual areas where you were trying to put up a site. But, you know, since that time, Jeff Bryan and his group have basically rolled all these plants up and are all under one big umbrella now. So he's lost a little bit of his grassroots support that way, I think, but still very successful, done a good job. The plant that I served on the board for almost 20 years, I think, was Northern Lights up at Millbank, North Dakota. We had Bryan helped us build that plant, came in as a small investor. But when the roll-up happened, not too many years ago, we were part of whether we should roll up into the Bryan umbrella or not. And our board and then our membership elected to do just that. But yeah, it's been a process, and it's been good.
Well, that's good. I'm glad you brought that up. That's important stuff. Well, if we go to the '86 election, then you said you kind of how does one decide I'm going to run for governor? How did that happen with you?
I don't know. I've been asked that question. I don't know that I've ever had a real clear answer on it, other than certainly, you know, one always assumes that, well, your dad was governor, you want to be governor or something. Well, maybe that was there a little bit, but I'd like to think that's not the reason that I ran for governor. The reasons are that I thought I could run a pretty efficient state to deliver goods and services to South Dakotans. And so this one son of a governor just happened to run against another son of a governor, George Mickelson, and of course I'd served with George. George was a friend. I mean, we were opposite, of course, and had policy differences, but in the legislature then versus maybe the way it is now, you were still friends at the end of the day. You might have a bill coming up further down the calendar that you were working the same side with, so you couldn't just not get along with people. You needed to get along with people, and I think that was good. It's one of the good things I think about a smaller state and its legislature. I know that there's criticism a lot of times of our type of legislature where we all have our own interests. I'm a farmer. Farm bills have a particular interest to me. The next bill is a banking bill, an insurance bill, an education bill. Certainly I want to hear from our educators, or our administrators, or our bankers, or our insurance people. I think it's good for the system. But we all have to recognize that, yeah, we do have these special interests in here. That's what the legislature is a number of special interests trying to bring something good for their particular industry. Whether it's for our kids out there in the education area, or whether it's for higher education, and we happen to represent a district that has Northern State University in it, and you're a graduate of the University of South Dakota. Doesn't mean that we should cut SDSU out of everything, which of course never happens. They have a very strong lobby.
Yes, they do.
Yeah. But I think it's the strength of a small legislature.
Right.
I think you lose some of that personal contact
Yeah.
and personal information when you make it a full-time job for somebody. When it's a full-time job for a legislator, they get to start isolating themselves from who they're representing. A little easier,
Yeah.
you know, because you're too busy.
Right.
But when they catch you at the sale barn at home when you're out of session, you're gonna listen.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
What did you think of, well, Governor Knight comes back and runs in the primary that year.
Yeah.
Were you surprised by that, or were you expecting
A
that?
little.
Yeah.
A little surprised that he would want to come back and run in that primary.
Yeah.
But, yeah. You know, one of those things you look back on, I know it was viewed, that primary in '86, as somewhat of an upset of my beating him.
Yeah.
Within our organization, we never had a doubt.
Okay.
We felt we were ahead all the way.
Yeah.
And we had a good organization put together. And we had been on the ground running before Knight decided he wanted to run and come back. And I think he maybe came back a little bit with that, well, how can you deny me, you know, a little bit, and took us for granted that we weren't going to be as tough as he thought we were.
Okay.
And we'd gone out there and done the work, and all of our nightly phone polling, I mean, we knew all the way along that we had an edge on them. So election night, when everybody else was surprised that I was able to take out this former governor,
Yeah.
we weren't surprised.
You weren't surprised?
No.
There was another candidate too in the primary.
Ken Stoffren.
Ken Stoffner? Okay.
When I first knew Ken, and of course he was a Republican legislator on the other side of the aisle.
Oh, he switched parties.
Yeah. Yeah, he had switched parties, not then, he had switched
Yeah.
parties earlier.
Okay.
And even when he was a Republican, if you asked the Republican caucus, they would have said he deserved to be on our side. Because he was one of those individuals I mentioned earlier that you could always count on their vote over there in a close vote.
Mhm.
Ken was one of those.
Okay.
So he did deserve to be on our side.
Okay. Well, do you think, when did he come back from Singapore?
I don't know exactly what the dates were, but
Yeah.
it would have had to be after Jimmy Carter lost, I suppose.
Right.
I don't know the timing there, but
Yeah.
all of a sudden your patron is no longer president.
Right.
You're coming home.
So '81, he probably came home and went back to, he was from Salem, right?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. You say your organization and polling and so forth. Do you remember, how much fundraising did you have to do for that campaign? Do you-
Well, quite a bit for that time.
Yeah.
You know, I don't remember exactly the numbers that we were filing, but they were kind of setting records. And of course, we knew we had a tough primary with
Yeah.
the former governor.
Yeah.
So we were spending a lot of what we were raising. We had a good direct mail fundraising
Okay.
apparatus put in place, plus you're on the phone a lot to your people. And so yeah, the fallback to that is when the primary ended, and we got hit right away from the Mickelson campaign with an ad that I'm sure that they had developed for Dick Knight and had to change the name. It had to do with the income tax, believe it or not.
I think I've seen this ad. Is this with J-Clo walking around the Capitol?
Oh, no, I don't know. It's not that ad.
Okay.
No, because this was George Mickelson
Right.
and his group that I'm sure thought they didn't know for sure whether they were coming out of their primary.
Right.
They had a very competitive primary,
Yes, they did.
but they were well organized also. I remember turning the corner on a cold, windy April morning and nobody wanted to be out there, and I turned the corner in Aberdeen, South Dakota into a residential area, and here's George Mickelson knocking on the door. I thought, this guy's serious, you know. And, he did the groundwork to get where he did to come out of that primary, because the congressman out of the 2nd District at that time, Roberts, he basically had him beat.
Yeah.
He went to sleep.
Okay.
You know, he went to sleep in that primary to let George win.
Yeah.
Dick Knipe took me for granted in our primary to let me win.
Yeah.
So it was destiny that these two governor's sons would run against each other.
Right. Well, it was an interesting year, 86, Jan-Clo's done being governor and runs against Abner and loses. So the primary, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the primary. It was,
Yeah, there was. I think maybe, and it probably wasn't the first time, but Alice Kundrent was in that primary on the Republican side.
yes, she was.
And so was our lieutenant governor
Yeah,
from here in Sioux Falls.
that's right.
He
So,
was in that.
Bill Doherty, though, the gentleman who doesn't tables, or keeps.
He votes no on
Vote no
on the tie vote.
bringing it on the agenda to.
Yeah,
What happened to, did he ever think, because he wanted to run for governor,
he did.
and, but he wasn't a part of the scene by 86.
He ran, no, he was enjoying being a lobbyist by that time.
Okay.
He was one of the two kind of notorious
Okay.
lobbyists. Jeremiah Murphy
Jeremiah.
and Bill Doherty were kind of the two bigger name lobbyists, you might say, along with a lot of others, which
Yeah.
included John Thune at one time, you know.
Yeah. Municipal League.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, then, in the general election, farm crisis is still an issue, and a lot of people, I'm sure, would think a farmer would have a leg up on a lawyer from Brookings.
Yeah.
For that.
It might be why I ran so close.
Yeah.
You know, Democrats
Right.
historically in the state, other than the little Knipe time there, have not fared very well.
Right, right,
And of course, Woolman when Knipe decided to go to Singapore, but
yeah.
other than that, we've had a tough time winning the governor's seat, and a much better history in winning congressional and
Yeah.
Senate seats.
Right. So I looked up the notes, I think it was 51.8% to 48.2% in 86 for governor. That's only 10,600.
Yeah, it wasn't many.
It's
A
close.
couple votes a precinct if they'd have changed.
Right. Well, and speaking of precincts or counties, where did you see your strength, and how did you kind of organize that campaign so you
Well, the Northeast
okay.
primarily,
Yeah.
pretty good solid Democrat district
Yeah.
up until lately, but it traditionally has been.
So Brown County.
And then down the Jim River Valley,
Okay.
and then Minnehaha County, we wanted to do as well as we could there,
Yeah.
and put a lot of our effort in there. We chose a lieutenant governor, Ted Toms,
Okay.
from Minnehaha County.
Okay.
We knew, as Democrats traditionally are, we get in trouble in West River. We don't have much out there.
Yeah.
We campaigned fairly hard out there, but it's pretty hard to make a dent out there. So we knew that we could still win it if we ran the James River Valley,
Okay.
Minnehaha County, and the Northeast.
Okay.
And if you look at the numbers that came in, they just about were that way.
Yeah.
We had a lead going into West River.
Oh, so you mean as election night was happening, you were ahead,
Yeah.
and then West River started?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah, I was even told about midnight that George Mickelson threw a shoe at the TV. I don't know whether that's true or not, but he was upset. Daschle was winning, Johnson was winning. I, at that point, was winning, but by a narrow margin.
Yeah.
I knew where our numbers were and where they weren't, so as we're celebrating in Brown County,
Yeah.
and Tim and Tom are getting ready to get on the plane and fly down to Minnehaha County
Okay.
and continue with the celebration,
Right.
I wasn't going because I knew that as the returns came in, this was going to get smaller and smaller.
Yeah.
And as a result, it did. So
Yeah. Okay. So you knew you needed East River numbers of.
I needed East
60%
River
or something
numbers
really
a little
strong.
higher than what we had, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but the plan that we had in place was a good plan. It just, it could have won that election. It just fell a little bit short
Right.
of having the numbers where we knew we were the strongest
Right.
to go West River with.
Right.
And that probably was Minnehaha County. I needed,
You needed more there.
yeah, in the other areas, we ran to what our expectations were and what we needed.
Okay.
Where we fell short was probably Minnehaha County.
Okay.
If we'd have had those few extra 1,000 votes in Minnehaha County, we had it.
Yeah. Okay.
It was a good competitive
Right.
competitive election. I came back into the Senate in '88.
Yeah.
I served with George and
Yeah.
with Walter Dale Miller,
Yeah.
and I think we did some pretty good things together. I mean, they were still adversaries in policy, but individually,
Yeah.
that was the kind of politics that we had back then, and I think the country could use more of today.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the George Mickelson throwing his shoe at the TV. Do you recall the phone call? I imagine you made a consolation phone call.
Yeah, I kind of recall it. It was late at night, and
Yeah.
it was pretty brief.
Right.
You know, it's just basically,
Yeah.
you know, good campaign.
Yeah.
Sorry you won? No, I didn't say that.
Do you think, I've talked to a lot of people about 86 campaign, because there's so much going on, and with Janklow and Abner, and the two sons of governors and so forth, and Mickelson had, well, I've been able to interview one of Mickelson's campaign staff, who then donated his campaign plan and a lot of their commercials and so forth to the archives. So we've gone over those and seen that. That's why I mentioned that. They
Yeah.
had an ad where outgoing Governor Janklow, after the primary, walked around the Capitol, which you can't do that. You can't make a political ad in the Capitol today. But
Yeah.
and he pointed to your chair in the State House and mentioned the number of votes you made about income taxes.
Oh, I
over the
suppose,
years.
yeah.
And then walked up to the governor's, then they panned over, or cut, and then they went to the governor's office, and they showed him, the man you want sitting in this chair is Mickelson, you know, because.
See, why don't I
don't
remember that
remember?
ad a little better?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it was a compelling ad.
Yeah.
Because.
I think that was the second go-around, though. That wasn't the first one out of the chute. And the first one out of the
Yeah.
chute is
Might have been
what
later.
we felt really put us, we had to answer it and we were out of money from our
Yeah.
primary.
Okay,
So we ran the whole general election a little shorthanded.
yeah,
And so I remember that first one. It was basically an income tax ad too. It didn't have Bill Janklow in it.
okay.
you know.
Yeah.
So I do kind of remember the Bill Janko ad, but that was a little later
Yeah.
on in the campaign, I think.
Well, let me ask you.
Was that Frank Brost? Did he lay out the?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Frank.
He's a good storyteller.
Yeah, he is. He is a good storyteller.
Well, no, it wasn't Frank Prost. It was some, he lives in Virginia now. I'll get you the name.
Oh.
I'm blanking on the name. I've got a podcast.
There was a retired general, like,
it wasn't him either. He's passed away.
yeah, I would expect that he'd be gone.
Yeah. They talked a lot about him and said, that it was such a well-run campaign, they usually close the doors at 5 o'clock at night because they'd done everything.
Well, except for George, he was still out there pounding on doors.
Yeah. Yeah,
That was their campaign plan, and it worked.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, then, so you have to sit out, and then you decide to run for Senate.
Yes.
Was it an open seat, or did you have a priority?
No, I had to take out a good friend of mine,
Oh, okay,
Peg Lamont, Senator Peg Lamont.
okay,
Is probably the most liberal Republican that ever sat in her caucus.
okay,
If there was a bill for any Department of Social Services bill that helped children or whatever, Peg was there.
yeah,
She was a good senator for Brown County.
yeah,
And she asked me even whether I wouldn't just wait another couple of years and she'd probably retire. And
yeah,
sometimes in looking back, you think maybe you should have done that because she was a friend. I mean, we flew back and forth to Pier together for years.
yeah,
And policy-wise, she was almost more liberal than I am. She was good. I'm sure the Republicans pulled their hair out once in a while having to deal with Peg
yeah,
in their caucus and on an appropriations committee
okay,
besides.
yeah,
So she was kind of a powerhouse in there when it came to those issues
right,
and did a good job of representing that underrepresented group, really.
right,
So, yeah, it was with some consternation that I made that decision to come back in '88, but needed to. I mean, you know, if I'm 100% honest about it, and I need to be for the sake of the Historical Society and everything else, I had a campaign debt out of running for governor.
okay,
And the only way I could partially, and we're in the middle of the egg crisis.
yeah,
There wasn't a lot coming out from the farm to service a campaign debt,
Yeah.
you know, so I had to keep running.
okay,
And so transferred a governor's campaign to a Senate campaign, raised more than I needed
yeah,
to run the Senate campaign so I could service the debt of the gubernatorial campaign.
okay,
And that was one of the reasons I chose that particular time.
yeah,
There were probably other reasons. I wanted to kind of get back in there too, and this was the opening to do that.
yeah,
You know, and Peg's wanting me to wait 2 more years. I kind of answered it by just saying, well, maybe you want to go 2 years earlier, you know. So that's kind of how that transpired.
okay, so you just let the voters pick,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, and now, the late 80s and so forth, what's the, interest rates are kind of getting back into line, I think by 90, 91, there's, you know, we've seen
That big spike.
the big spike is
Yeah,
back, different, well, Greenspan, I guess, had a different philosophy about things than
yeah.
Volcker and those guys, so. What were the issues, though, that hit you in the Senate?
Healthcare
Okay,
became probably, outside of our ones that are there every year,
yeah,
healthcare became the dominant issue for a few sessions because of the Clinton healthcare plan that after the election of Bill Clinton and then Hillary
yeah,
kind of taking the reins of the healthcare bills, And quite honestly, one of the best things really that could happen for, I'm sure some insurance companies wouldn't think so, but for reform in the healthcare industry, the Clinton bill, though it didn't pass, created all kinds of reform on the state level. Because all of a sudden on bills that would reform healthcare from the insurance side of things, where they could, you get claims, they'd throw you out of the pool, and those types of things that were happening and really creating a hardship in the insurance end of the healthcare business. All of a sudden there was a willingness on behalf of individuals on the other side of the aisle to take some of these issues on. In fact, Mike Rounds and I co-sponsored some of that legislation that prior to that Clinton health care plan, you didn't get any cooperation out of reforming the health care deal.
Well, he's an insurance guy. He would kind of understand some of that.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
He understood it very well.
Right.
So, yeah, it was good to have him become an ally
Mm-hmm.
on some of those issues. And those were kind of around the surface of the overall issue of healthcare, which is a big issue on a lot of different fronts. But we did make some progress after '92 because they knew that they needed to have some excuse on the state level to fight it on the national level.
I see.
In other words, we got to put some reforms in place on the state level so they got better arguments on the national level as to why we don't need a national health care plan.
Okay.
So they say politics makes strange bedfellows, and in this case it did.
Yeah. So, well, are you in the Senate then when Governor Mickelson's plane crashes? Are you in office then?
Yes.
Okay. So you were, remember the funeral?
Oh, yeah.
So when you heard the news, were you at home or?
No, I was out in the field cultivating corn.
Okay.
I was on a tractor.
On a tractor?
Yeah, as being a good legislator, out doing what I'm supposed to do to make a living, not do it in Pierre.
Right.
So I had a neighbor stop at the end of the field and say, "Did you hear what happened?"
Okay.
And I said, "No, I hadn't at that point heard." And that was that morning.
Okay.
So yeah, very, very tragic time for that family, for our state. Yeah. Unfortunate.
Right. Were there things then that, well, before the crash and before his death, I wanted to ask you about, one of the things that he's most known for is the Year of Reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
And he announces that, I think, in January of '91. You would have been in the Senate then, right?
Yes.
January '91. So, do you remember that speech? I think it was a State of the State address, and he brings that up right at the end.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I remember it, should I say vaguely,
Sure.
because it didn't get a lot of attention at the time.
Right, right. Were there bills and so forth, or were there activities that he did as a part of that? And within your caucus?
I don't remember. Most of the Native Americans were in our caucus.
Right, right.
Not all of them. We had Jim Emery over there representing.
Okay. Roosevelt?
No, he was Homestake Mine up in Lawrence County.
Oh, okay, okay.
And so Lawrence County, whatever that district was there. But he was, his job outside the legislature was Homestake.
Okay.
So that's why I said Homestake Mine, but that's sometimes what we do, you know. And a good guy. I remember him, had a lot of good conversations with him on the floor. And of course, with our own Native Americans in our caucus also, they were friends of mine.
Right. Do you
Yeah,
remember
I
the
think-
discussions
I
about
think
that?
there was a little
Congress?
feeling that it was maybe a gesture at the time that maybe wasn't gonna have a lot of substance behind it,
Mhm.
that it was more a gesture than it was heartfelt.
Mhm.
But I think that we ended up finding out that it was with purpose, that it was put out and needed,
Yeah,
still needed to this day.
yeah.
You know, we just need to do more in that area. There are fellow South Dakotans,
Yeah.
and we can do a lot more
Yeah.
there.
Do you remember one of the bills out of that would have been the Native American Day, making it a state holiday. Was there a lot of argument about that,
No.
or did it kind of pass? It just-
No, it just kind of went through. There wasn't a lot of argument about it.
Okay.
There weren't too many people standing up for Columbus.
Yeah. It's ironic because Columbus Day was pushed through by Roosevelt, I think, because he wanted something for the Italian Americans. And they were growing as a constituency.
As a voting bloc,
as a
yeah.
voting bloc, and so he pushed that through in the 30s to get that.
Huh.
Yeah. so,
Yeah, that's just a little part of the history I didn't realize.
Right. Well, then toward the in the 90s, and when did you leave the Senate, or when was your last?
96 was my
96.
last session.
Okay. So you got to
Election
do-
in 94, and you served 95, 6.
Yeah. And Janko runs again in 96.
No, he runs
No,
in 94.
So you get to deal with him again.
Yeah,
And
for
were
2
you-
more
For
years.
2 more years.
Yeah.
Were you in a leadership position then?
Yes.
Okay. So what
Yeah.
were there?
In fact, remember, just prior to that, we took control of the Senate.
That's right.
Yeah.
So you're the majority leader.
No,
Okay.
Roger McKellips was
Okay.
when we had the majority. Roger McKellips was
Okay.
the
Was the leader.
majority leader, and I was the president pro tem of the Senate.
Okay.
So it was Walter Dale Miller and I
Okay.
in the Senate.
Okay.
Interesting
Yeah.
story with Walter Dale, because when I came there as a freshman, of course, he had been there
Yeah.
earlier, and we're on the Ag Committee together. I can't even remember what bill it was, but it was back we were competitive about as, they had just retaken the House to have a slim majority in the House. We still had a majority in the Senate.
Okay.
And I had some bill in the Ag deal that he didn't like, and he was late getting there, and we had just passed it.
Oh.
And he came through the door and he threw his books down and walked out. And so our early days with Walter Dale Miller and I were not always very good.
Yeah.
But as time went on, I think we certainly developed a kind of a long-term respect for one another.
Yeah.
We were on opposite sides on the railroad, which is an issue that we need to maybe visit with a
Yeah.
little too before we
Yeah.
go. But Walt and I, over the years, just kind of said, hey, we're both here. We don't agree very often, but I've kind of gotten to like you. And that was my feeling with Walt.
Yeah.
When he was governor, filling in that term for George,
Yeah.
and my mother passed away, there was nobody any better than Walt Miller in how he treated our family
Yeah.
and my mother, and he and Pat were just very gracious. I'll never forget it. And again, kind of reminds me of more of what we need in our politics
Yeah.
today.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Sure.
So Walt and I kind of grew on each other.
Sure. Well, you mentioned the railroads. This may be whenever you're ready to
Yeah.
start again.
Let me get a little drink.
Sure. I'm going to call it a walk here.
Okay. How we doing on time?
It's a quarter after 3.
Got a little time
So
yet.
got a
but-
little time.
Yeah.
You mentioned Janklow was, I think you used the term populist. That's come up a lot. And that kind of, when he first lobbied and has fought to buy the railroads in the early 80s, it's clearly not a typical Republican thing to do, to take over a business that's failing and throw the public money down on it and so forth. What was by the 90s though, it's looking pretty smart.
Oh,
I
yeah.
imagine. And there
Yep.
might be a lot of GOPers who are wanting to take credit for that, or were there still some naysayers or folks wanting to sell them off, or as we get into the 90s, how does that?
Nobody suggested selling them off
Okay.
at that point. But we were, it was kind of 2 stages.
Yeah.
You know, and I might say that was a bipartisan effort.
Okay.
Without the Democrats staying pretty solid in there,
Yeah.
Bill Janklow would have never had his railroad.
Okay.
It was an element of the Republican Party that wanted to stay true with Bill, and also with the leadership in the House and the Senate at that time, which was Joe Barnett
Okay.
and I believe Harold Halverson
Okay.
was the leader from up in the Millbank area on the Senate side. I might be wrong on that. It was either that or Homer Harding
Okay.
from Pierre,
Okay.
who was the leader on the Senate side. So he had a contingent of Republicans that would stick with him there, and he had practically the whole Democrat caucus
Yeah.
on buying out this railroad that was going bad,
Yeah.
and also coming to the aid of finding a home for the main line. There was a main line, which was the Chicago Northwestern,
Right.
that ran from Minneapolis, Milwaukee, all the way out to Spokane
Yeah.
through Aberdeen. And then there was the core system, which was old Milwaukee, that ran crisscross across the state. So it was kind of a 2-step project. And of course, initially in that legislation, he had this railroad authority set up where they would run the railroad,
Yeah.
which was where the Democrat caucus had a little problem with that. They were saying, no, we need to maintain this rail, not let it get wiped out of there. You know, if they abandon it, pretty soon everything's gone. So you gotta hold it, but you didn't want to get the state involved in running it. Bill's original bill had the state running the railroad.
Okay.
And of course, that didn't sit at all well with the likes of Walter Dale Miller and that group
Yeah.
on the other side
Yeah.
of that particular issue. And we went back and forth on that because they knew that they needed Democrat support.
Yeah.
In fact, some years after, Bill would always give us credit, and me some of the credit, and
Yeah.
stuff for holding that deal together.
Okay.
But it wasn't too many years, and it kind of became Bill's railroad. You know? But in the beginning, it was kind of our railroad, and it was a coalition of some Republicans over there, which was probably close to a majority of their caucus,
Yeah.
and then almost 100% of our caucus. I can't remember whether we lost anybody in our caucus
Yeah.
to make that, but we weren't going along with that. We'd vote to kill it once in a while. It had a number of lives, as most legislation does,
Yeah.
until they would take out the authorization for the state rail authority to run the railroad. we wanted all of the hardware and real estate kept in place so we could find somebody who was a railroad operator to run the railroad,
Okay.
not some state that had no idea how to run a railroad,
Yeah.
some state office holder saying, I'm going to be an engineer.
Secretary of Transportation.
Right.
Or something. Yeah.
And I remember standing out in the halls. I can't remember the name of that individual, not that it makes a lot of difference, but I was with Joe Barnett. And we'd had 2 or 3 votes on it, and they'd always come up short because we were, as a Democrat caucus, sitting over there with Walter Dale Miller and his crew, killing it until they'd take out that rail authority
Yeah.
right to operate that railroad.
Okay.
And Joe Barnett called me over in the side where the legislators are, and he says, here, we've got this amended now so that it takes that out of there. And I said, are you sure? Show it to me. And he takes it and gives it to this guy who's representing Janko and says, okay, show me where you took it out. And we knew about in the bill where it was at because it was a bill probably 20-some pages long. And we get to that section and it's still in there. And Joe Barnett looks at him and hands him that bill and says, get it out of there now.
Yeah.
You know, and about 15 minutes later, it came zipping back in, and it was where we were at in the negotiations.
Yeah.
It was out of there,
Yeah.
and we passed it.
Okay.
So that's a little of the history of the railroad, which I think was a very good move.
Yeah.
You know, we got some operating railroads today. I know it's still a struggle for some railroads to operate, but at the same time, it allowed them to also be eligible for some federal funding to rehab some of that stuff.
Yeah.
And of course, some of it they never could. I mean, there's part of the old core system that probably should just be sold off. So, but we kept the main line up here, which was a good money-making deal.
Yeah.
And we did that basically with bonds.
Okay. So was there, you mentioned you find somebody to run it. Who then chose, once you got that out of there, that bill passes, that version goes into law, who then chose, was there a contractor then that ran the day-to-day?
Yeah, I can't remember. It was Dakota, Montana,
DM&E?
DM&E.
Okay.
Yeah.
And was the thinking that we have to keep, you mentioned to keep them viable, the railroad's
Right.
in good shape, that all this kind of stuff, was the thinking that someday we might want to sell it off and we got to have a quality piece of property or something?
Well, that's basically what happened with the main line.
Yeah.
I mean, we bought that right away also from
Okay.
state to state,
Yeah.
border to border. And yet we kind of made a deal fairly quick with Burlington Northern to take a
Okay.
portion of that. And basically leased it to them with a right to buy.
I see.
And so they leased it from us with a right to buy, and at that point bought it.
Okay.
So that resource stayed in place. The old core system, that of course had areas that were never going to probably be able to service the railroad,
Yeah.
other than the core system itself is still there. But there were little spurs off from it that just never happened. And I think DM&E has changed hands a couple times, hasn't it?
Probably. Yeah, sure.
I haven't really kept track as to who's running that today, but they're running some pretty good-sized trains on it today.
Yeah.
And a lot of the ethanol industry growth that took place later would have been hard for it to take place had that rail line not stayed in place.
Sure.
Both the core system and the main line,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, is there, of course, there's certainly an interest in your daughter who gets into politics too. Was she hanging around you? Was she part of your campaigns? Was your
Yeah.
campaigns kind of a family enterprise? And,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it was. And of course, in our family, you know, I think even at a young age, when I was that young age, our, dinner time conversation wasn't
Right.
about some sports team or something out here, it was about politics. You know, it's from a
Right.
early age you get quite a bit of that, and of course Stephanie was exposed to that too,
Yeah.
and kind of took to it. Her brother Todd also, but maybe to a little lesser extent. He gave some thought at one time of running for a House seat or something, and then decided his job wouldn't allow him to do that, so he didn't. But Stephanie, from a very young age, I mean, she went around the state and was very good. I mean, not even with my dad cap on, I think she is one of the, better kind of politicians that I've seen that can go into a room and connect with people. I mean, she's got this tremendous memory for names, and she's got this kind of outgoing personality that people just kind of warm up to it, you know.
Yeah.
And I could, when her early campaigns, I could go around some and watch her and see her, and I'd just shake my head and say, wow, that's a talent that I think a lot of us in political life wish that we had to that extent.
Yeah.
Because she, it served her well. It served her well in the business world. It served her well as president of the university, Augustana University. And it'll continue serving her well the rest of her life, depending whatever she wants to do. So, and of course, when you look at the politics today, you kind of, as a dad, say, I hope it isn't politics, because it's turned into kind of a nasty world out there.
Is there something that strikes you about what's prompted that, or is there a lot of little things, or why do you think
Well,
politics has changed?
you know, I guess I'm as puzzled as everybody else. It's very easy, I guess, to go to the easy scapegoat and say it's Facebook and all of the other social media out there that has created a lot of this. Well, yeah, it's allowed a lot of that to maybe coalesce a little more and communicate. But these people that are so mad at the world have always been out there.
Yeah.
And Facebook has maybe, and social media, allowed them to communicate with one another a little better. And maybe that's created some of it. So I don't have the answer. So all I know is that our democracy needs two good, viable parties to make it work. Not just a Democrat Party who believes in democracy, and we need a Republican Party who also believes in democracy. And so a lot of the solutions that lay in the future for us to maintain this experiment that we have, a lot of that responsibility lies in the Republican Party to not want to destroy our institutions, but want to build on them. And, I can't say it any other way, because I want it to continue. I think a lot of us don't stop to kind of realize what it would mean if all of a sudden we don't have the rule of law, that one individual is basically making the decision of whatever administration is going to be happening in any of our ag departments or Veterans Affairs or any of that. I mean, I don't think we can visualize it. That's why we are so close to tempting its demise. And otherwise, yeah, we have to have the way our system is set up, a strong two-party system. I believe as much in the Republican Party as I do the Democrat Party, because it's through the two of us in exchanging and debating policy that our democracy can continue to function. One of them goes away and no longer decides that democracy is what they want, it's going to fail.
Yeah.
And I don't want to kind of be too negative on that, but we're at risk.
Yeah.
And we need to realize that.
Yeah. Well, is there anything you think remains to be said? Or is there a story out there that you think needs to go into the collection that you need to share with us?
I don't know, let me look at my notes once here, just to see. I think we touched on most of them.
Okay.
I did make a few notes. I didn't know whether, I knew I couldn't sit here in front of the camera and read them. We mentioned healthcare, ethanol. Flying, railroads, repeal of the personal property tax, also under Knife.
Okay. Well, if there's
Also, the kind of social legislation that is happening. I know that's a touchy subject, but maybe should be touched on just a little bit.
Well, let's talk about, did Knife make that when he was running for governor against you? Was there an inter-party discussion about what the strength, I mean, Knife's guys have put a ton of work into the income tax and the restructuring of the whole thing, along with the constitutional restructuring, not only the terms in office, but the boards and commissions, all of this. It just looks to me that he had a wealth of homework done on that particular issue when he decided to throw his name back in the ring for 86 and so on. So was he coming back to say, we gotta get the tax thing through, or?
No, I think he was even at that stage steering away from the income tax.
Okay.
You know, that never became part of our debates.
Yeah.
I think he was relying a little more on just his record as that deserved for him to be back in there.
Okay.
And I think, you know, there was also a big segment, as obviously that election showed, of the party saying, well, you know, you've been good for us, you've led us for a long time, but it's also time to move on. And I maybe a little of that arrives at the aspect that he wins this other term for governor and then decides to go to Singapore and be the ambassador.
Yeah.
Kind of like leaving you after
Yeah.
he's got you there, you know.
Yeah. What was the sense do you remember where you were when you heard he was gonna do that? Or what
No,
was
I
it?
don't remember. Because the rumor was out there earlier. Well, what if Dick Knipe decides he wants? Well, what if he does? I can't sit here waiting for him to make up his mind. We're making our mind up.
Okay.
So there was a little sense of urgency on our behalf to make sure that we got our announcement out there earlier.
Okay.
But that was about all. I mean, he did have a resume that, you know, certainly I think had he worked that campaign a little bit differently, probably never would have opened the door for me.
Yeah.
And I know one of those things was the repeal of the personal property tax that came in there, and I know Democrats like to be known, or the other side have us known as people that like taxes, but nobody, including Democrats, like the personal property tax. You know, somebody coming into your house to find out how old your stove or your range or refrigerator, or do you really have a wood stove or not, and how many shotguns are in this house? And then it goes outside, and how many pigs do you have? Are they little pigs, or are they big pigs, or old cattle, young cattle, or, I mean, really, it was the most unlike tax in the world.
Sure.
From that aspect, it was very easy to repeal.
Okay.
But
So
a little harder to find the revenue. But
Yeah. When did that occur, the repeal? Was it early 90s?
trying to remember that date
Or
for
did
sure.
J-Clo works to get that done, right? In the
No, I
same
think
time,
that
right?
was Dick Knipe.
Oh, okay. As a part of the repeal the
I
personal
think it
property
was.
tax.
We maybe will have to
Okay.
look that up, but I think that was Dick Knipe repeal of the personal property tax.
Okay. Okay.
And they had to expand then the tax base.
Yes.
Yeah, Could that have been Janklow? I don't think so. I think it was under Knight, but
Okay,
something certainly to check before we would allow this portion of it to go to air, because I can't remember for sure, but I thought it was Dick Knight.
okay,
And the broadening of the sales tax
yeah,
to include a few areas that weren't included to make up the revenue difference for the
Okay.
repeal.
okay.
But I felt that was under Knight, and I might be wrong.
So in the debates about the repeal then, there was nobody jumping up and down to save it, it was just, the issue was where are we gonna replace it?
That's right.
Yeah,
The issue and the differences were not whether we should get rid of this tax that nobody liked. It was, where's the money coming from?
right,
And of course, every industry that was getting expanded into didn't like it, so,
right, right.
you know, maybe that's why we ended up with a car tax or something, you know,
Yeah.
we never used to. The taxes on automobiles used to be your licensing tax,
Right.
not a sales tax.
Now it's a
There
sales
wasn't a
tax.
sales tax on
Yeah,
it. But, you know, some of those things, they needed the revenue.
right,
When they needed the revenue, the sales tax is always a big area to get it, or professional services.
right,
You never, if you got a bill from your attorney, you never used to have a tax on that.
okay,
Now you get a tax on professional services,
yeah,
or your accountant, or whatever. That was part of the broadening of those.
yeah. I was reading about, the usury tax, change that enticed Citibank to consider coming to South Dakota. And Bill Janklow mentioned in one thing I was reading, that he asked the, CEO of the Gold Stake Mine, Homestake Mine, to come and talk to him because he wanted to slap a tax on gold, because he needed to find, this would have been in '81, his first year in office, needed to find $6 million. He was in the hole, $6 million. He'd already cut all this kind of stuff that he couldn't cut any more, and he was gonna be in the hole, $6 million. Do you remember that kind of?
No, because Homestake already had an income tax.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and the guy flew out from California and basically said, "What do you want, Bill?" And he, and Janklow said, "I just gotta find $6 million, so I'm just gonna tax you. I'm gonna pass a bill that taxes you $6 million." No.
Well, maybe we did increase it, but you know,
Yeah.
they were the only entity in the state of South Dakota that paid an income tax.
Yeah, okay,
They paid a tax on their income.
yeah,
And whenever you'd make the argument that maybe other businesses should pay a tax on their income, no,
that was.
just Homestake. So maybe you got a little more money out of Homestake. I vaguely remember we had to tweak it a little bit.
Right.
But I don't think that was to get Citibank.
No,
I
it
think
wasn't-
that
it
was
wasn't
more
just-
just for a
just
budgetary
budgetary
problem.
balance
Yeah,
of books, yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, Citibank was a whole different deal of
right,
changing our usury laws to attract them in there.
right. Well, what was
Which-
do you recall the debate about changing the usury laws?
Yeah, I remember that it wasn't a real big debate,
Right, I think,
you know, and a little bit. There were certainly a few on our sides that said, oh, this isn't quite right. But by that time, you know, we're all getting hammered with these other things that are beyond usury rate, like credit cards, so,
yeah, yeah,
you know. So getting rid of our usury rate or making it a little more lenient
right,
didn't mean as much then as it would have 20 years earlier.
right.
So there wasn't a real big debate over it.
Yeah,
I think when he came up with Citibank deal and what we needed to do, after having done what his administration had done,
yeah,
he had pretty good bipartisan support.
right,
He had, as I recall, some negative votes from our side of the aisle, but all in all, it had a substantial majority of both
okay,
caucuses.
okay. And it was, I think the bill had to formally invite Citibank to come to the state for federal legal reasons, or federal, they needed a.
Yeah, I don't remember all the language in there, but more of it had to do with the lessening of the usury rate.
Right,
So Citibank could kind of charge what they wanted to charge,
right,
you know. So maybe we had to give them an official
yeah,
invite or something for
I think.
FDIC to recognize it or something.
Yeah,
yeah.
charter credit card operation in
Yeah.
South Dakota needed to be.
Yeah.
But what did you think of, since we're talking about Citibank and so forth, what did you think of then the change for Dakota State's mission? They needed to, government put through that, add that computer science to their.
I think that was probably a pretty good change for Dakota State, but that was also, I think, tied up, and I might have to check my memory on that too, but that was also tied up with the closing a college at Springfield.
Right. And what did you think?
And the change of the role for Dakota State.
Yeah.
So that's what made it controversial, not the change of role for Dakota State.
Okay.
I think people were okay with that because they saw a way forward.
Right.
The closing of Springfield, I think, was a whole different.
Right.
There were a lot of people on both sides that were against that.
Yeah.
It was a little more regional. It
Sure.
was kind of, everybody from down in there is going to take up the mantle for Springfield.
Sure.
And even though Bill Janko is going to promise them a woman's prison or something in exchange, they didn't think that was a real good exchange.
Wasn't
But to his credit, I still remember seeing news flashes of him down there in an auditorium in some town down there, and the whole town is there, and a few of the towns surrounding, and they're all against this change, and there's Bill Janko. You know, he was there making his pitch.
Yeah.
He was kind of amazing that way.
Yeah.
But it certainly was a little more controversial, but the controversial part was closing Springfield, not a change of mission for Dakota State.
Okay.
And of course, those of us that come from areas that represent Black Hills State or Northern are all seeing that maybe we're dropping down a peg and we're gonna be the one that people are picking on, you know?
Yeah, you'd be the slow.
Yeah, we'll be the low-hanging fruit, so we want to keep this low-hanging fruit out.
Right. Right.
So they didn't get a lot of votes to close Southern
Yeah.
from Northern.
Southern, that's right. It's often forgotten that was called Southern.
Yeah.
Yeah. He also, I think Governor Jankel had to reorganize the Board of Regents a little bit to get some folks lined up. Did he have to increase the number? And there was also, I think it was in the statute at the time, you couldn't have a regent be from the town where a school was, and he.
Oh, yeah, I don't really remember that well, but there was that change that took place. I don't remember who was for or against, whether it had to be legislative. I think maybe it had to be legislative.
Yeah.
And everybody knew that the minute this changes, every county that has institution of higher education in it is going to want their member on the Board of Regents,
Sure.
which is about what happened.
Yeah, almost instantly.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty close. I think, some of the other, as we're kind of drawing to close here, everyone, one of the other things that I think needs to be mentioned about state government, about government in itself, is, and we're guilty of that in South Dakota too, and it was beginning to happen as I was ending my time in the South Dakota legislature. And that was taking some of these social issues and really politicizing them to the point where it's a detriment to the individuals involved. And I remember one of the bills in one of my last sessions there that had to do with the marriage between a man and a woman, which sounds certainly logical, but if you are a member of the LGBTQ community, that bill was somewhat hurtful. And I know a friend of mine was working with that bill on the side to pass it, who I know had a daughter with Down syndrome. And I wanted to remind him that a few decades and generations earlier, families that had Down syndrome children in them were discriminated against. And so how could you have this bill whose family might have somebody that is gay or lesbian in it and discriminate against them? Because that's really what those kind of bills do. And I know from the Senate floor, I gave a speech against this bill, and sometimes some of the things we remember aren't the things that we won, but the things that we lose. And I had a niece that had recently come out to my mother, her grandmother. And of course, Mom had written a little book with over a lot of instances of her life, a little biography, autobiography. And she had mentioned Allison's coming out to her and how she loved her just the same. And I was relaying this to the House floor. And I looked around the room and I could even see an individual out there who I knew his family somewhat. I knew that there was a gay son to this individual. I know he was on the other side of this bill. He was for that bill. I don't know whether he knew his son was gay. I knew it. I knew my niece was. But the bill ended up passing. And I think about those things as I watch our legislature after I've been gone for a long time. And I'm not very happy with some of those things because I think what it's trying to do is divide us. It's kind of a part of this thing that has happened in our politics where we're not trying to unite people, but we're trying to divide them. Divide these people against these people. And I think that's really potentially putting our whole system in jeopardy. And certainly I feel for the individuals that are involved. You know, it's one thing to talk about freedom in South Dakota, but I think if you were to talk to our LGBTQ community, you'd have a different vision of what freedom in South Dakota is. I think if you were to talk to our women, where in the state of South Dakota we had a trigger law for the repeal of Roe v. Wade, where all of a sudden their healthcare choices are limited. They're not free to make their healthcare choices anymore. I think they'd have a different idea of what freedom in South Dakota is. And I think we need to be aware going forward that we need to try to concentrate our legislation into things that help us all solve some of the problems that we have in the state and make it a better place for all of us to live, which I noticed one of your questions was, how do you compare living in South Dakota now to then? I think South Dakota is a great place to live, either then and now. But challenges then were different than what they are today. And I'd say some of the challenges that we have today are probably greater than what we had back then. So I hope we're up to it. Yeah. I think we are. But we need to work on it because it isn't always there from our leadership.
Well said. Well, thank you, sir.
Yeah, you're welcome. I've enjoyed it. Did we use up enough time, or do I have to do a little fill? I can look at my notes and come up with a little more fill time.
What do you think?
No, I think that was a great ending.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a great ending.
All right.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you, sir.